Siblings and sisters and brothers in Christ, welcome to Tuesdays for Nurture. I'm your host, Reverend Dr. Chris Davies, and I am so excited to be with you today. Tuesdays for Nurture is a program where we faithfully focus on education for the people of God, with everything from faith-filled politics to interviews of key leaders to how-tos in congregational life and the impacts of current realities on the life of the church. And all of these webinars will have suggestions about what you and your church can do. Today seems to be punctuated by my cat, who is definitely determined to join this conversation. So TBD on that. In the midst of everything else, what I want to make sure that we talk about is that we are diving into the archives today to think through some of these stories. We'll look at specific moments in our shared history and think through how what this means for us together as we look forward. The United Church of Christ has a history full of the stories of people, and we came together crying, "Let them all be one," and we've been seeking ways to unite ever since. So I am joined today by two incredible archivists and historians, so I want to introduce them to you at this point. First, Caroline Dunleavy is the executive director of the ENR Historical Society, where she was recently hired as their first ever ED. Her 2-year appointment was funded by a generous grant from the Arcadia Foundation, and she's been a longtime volunteer with the Historical Society, most recently serving as a co-chair of the Development Committee. She is a seasoned nonprofit professional who began her career in the reinsurance industry. And she's been a music minister for many years in the Pennsylvania Southeast Conference, who are very well represented, I know, both in the folks who are present here in this call and those of you watching the YouTube to follow. So welcome to all of you, and welcome to Caroline.
Thank you, Chris. It's so wonderful to be here this afternoon with everyone.
Also joining us, I want to introduce Edward Cade, who is the Associate for Historical Preservation and the Archivist for the National Setting of the United Church of Christ. Ed has been in the archives of the UCC since 2001, beginning as the archivist in 2011. He's also a part-time instructor staff at Lakewood Community College, where he teaches American history survey courses. Ed lives in South Euclid, Ohio, with his wife Leslie, daughter Victoria, and faithful canine companion Luna. Welcome, Ed.
Hi, how's everybody? It's cool in Cleveland, at least today. Not too bad, though.
So before we dive into everything, which I know we have a whole bunch of key things to show you, I want to start by entering a little bit into your stories. So I want to ask, starting with Caroline, what is your entry into the UCC? How did you get here?
Well, this is actually an interesting story, not just because you asked me about it, Chris, but my friends, especially in Pennsylvania Southeast Conference, many of them know I was Lutheran all of my life until 2011 when I entered the UCC. Many people fainted because they thought I would never do that. As lovely as the UCC is, I was just such a dyed-in-the-wool Lutheran girl. But my son, Aiden, was making confirmation, and he decided that he wanted to join the UCC. And I said, well, if you join, I think I'll join too.
The youth will lead us. We say this, and you're a living example of that being true. How about for you, Ed? Like, what is it that brought you here?
Literally, I had never heard of the United Church of Christ until I was called by the archivist who was looking for an assistant. Now, I had just moved to Cleveland with my wife and was looking for a job, and lo and behold, this individual was looking. So I got hired and have been increasingly drawn in by the remarkable social justice history of this institution. It's just amazing.
And I think, particularly stepping off of that into, I think this is such a time for this conversation. The pieces that each of you have chosen to lift up are reflective of the traditions that have really formed many of us in this denomination. Not all of us, but many of us in various ways. And for those with connection to traditions that are not necessarily accessible right now because of how we gather or don't, how we hold space or don't, how we are intentional about all of this, to lift up some of these tangible pieces of our history, I think is really incredible. Additionally, particularly in this year of reckoning of social justice, and how will we do this with intentionality looking forward, to know whence we've come and look forward is intentional. We need to know our history before we can change it, because as these patterns continue, they continue. So, without further ado, I want to, I'm going to circle back to that other question later that I mentioned to the two of you, because I want to get going with what we have that feels very exciting. So I want to start with Caroline. You brought into the conversation a piece of our ritual that really holds up so much of this tradition. So I'm going to invite you to share while that comes up on the screen.
Thanks, Chris. So the first item that we have today from the ERHS side of the presentation is Pewter Communion, where now this comes from, of course, the Reformed or our tradition. This is colonial era, and it's a set that was commissioned by Michael Schlatter in 1748. And made by Johann Christoph Heine. And we want to show this so that we highlight the importance of communion for the early German Reformed congregations. Often when German Reformed people were immigrating into the colonies in the early 1700s, they brought with them a Bible, a book of printed sermons, the Heidelberg Catechism, and the Palatinate liturgy. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar, the Heidelberg reference and the Palatinate reference, these are geographical references to what is now Southwest Germany. And some UCC members who might be on here, longtime members, might have experience with the Heidelberg Catechism through their confirmation, I believe. I've heard that many times. But lack of ordained clergy was an issue in the colonies. So the Reformed people often had to ask a respected person among them, often a teacher, to lead worship and also to administer Holy Communion. And I think you can see this with the organization of Falkner Swamp Reformed Church in Eastern Pennsylvania in 1725. This is considered to be America's oldest German Reformed church, and they convinced a teacher, John Philip Bohm, to administer communion and to conduct their services. And this went on into other means of trying to find clergy. There was a lot of cooperation with the Dutch Reformed at the time, the synods of North and South Holland, and the classis of Amsterdam to supply clergy and funding. But Bohm and some other German Reformed folks, as more the population grew of German Reformed, finally, in 1746, Michael Schlatter was sent to Pennsylvania. And Michael Schlatter visited all of the organized congregations, gave pulpit Bibles to them to be used in the church, and met the clergy. And finally, in 1747, organized the Cetus, or the Synod, and started organizing the congregations. And he continued to travel around to preach and administer communion. So I wanted to bring a few notes to contemporary meaning to this. Falkner Swamp is still a living UCC congregation today. In fact, we want to give a special shout out to our friends at Falkner Swamp. They hosted ERHS for a regional event in 2019 before COVID. And I think we will show or have a resource listed for their website just to show you they really are still here 300 years later. And I think that's fabulous. And also, I want to give a little bit of a plug for the UCC Historical Council's UCC Roots columns. You can sign up for these and get them delivered to your inbox every month. And two of them specifically that I want to point out, I'm sure there are many that relate to what we're talking about today, but there was one special column written by one of ERHS's friends, Rick Taylor, on the relationship with the Dutch Reformed and some of what we just talked about with Falkner Swamp. And I think we'll have a resource listed to that. And also there was one about Michael Schlatter from last year written by yours truly. And I think we'll have a listing for that as well.
Thank you so much. You know, as you're talking, I'm mindful that some of those key things that were the challenges of church administration then are still so real today. How do we find the funding for clergy? How do we appropriately find clergy in areas that of the country, you know, that are more rural or small congregations, or all of these questions are I'm drawing connections for my work, so I'm appreciative that you are bringing that in now. And also I want to name that, you know, even as we're looking towards this history, there's hidden history behind it. We're not lifting up everything. We're not naming who was there and who was already there before we who have history within the United Church of Christ in this particular way came into the areas and into the conversation. So I would be remiss without pointing that out, and aware that even that both things can be true. You know, we can have pride in our history and we can learn from it to be attentive to how we hold up our values going forward. So I think that is absolutely worth saying. But we're going to continue on this timeline. We're doing this in a way that's chronological to lift up everything that is present. And Ed, I know you have something to share that will bring us a little bit more along the way.
Yes, so there we are. This is from 1826, and I believe it might very well be the oldest object in the UCC archives. It's an item that comes from the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. It's a safe passage document that reads, "By the President of the United States of America, suffer the schooner missionary packet, James H., I can't pick out his last name, master and commander of the burthen of 38 tons or thereabouts, mounted with no guns, navigated by 5 men to pass with her company, passengers, goods, merchandise, without any hindrance, seizure, or molestation. The said schooner appeared by good testimony to belong to one or more members of the citizens of the United States and to him or them only. Given by under my hand and the seal of the United States of America, the 13th day of January in the year of our Lord, 1826. It is signed by John Quincy Adams and the Secretary of State, Henry Clay." The schooner in question, by the way, was purchased by ABC-FM in order to provide service to its missionaries in the Sandwich Islands, which of course is Hawaii. So it's a really interesting piece.
And connects more with our collective United Church of Christ history in terms of how we participated in various efforts of colonization and the work that we've done with intentionality to learn more and do better. And correct me if I'm wrong on my timeline there, Ed.
Yeah, they really were very active in going to the Pacific region early on. And this really highlights that activity, that they realized that they needed their own ships in order to transport their missionaries. And of course, from Hawaii on, they expand into the South Pacific and ultimately China.
We know the living impacts of that even today, and how we do church together, and the reflective ways in which we function together as the United Church of Christ across the whole of our people. And I sometimes get this sense, and maybe those of you who are attentive as well, um, are following that, to look at our history is to acknowledge all those places where we've fallen short, where we could have done so much better. And there's a part of me that wants to turn away from that, because of all sorts of stuff, I would say. And there's a stronger part of me that says, as we create the world we want for our great, 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 great grandchildren, we need to know this. We cannot let this go. And we want to also be attentive that 200 years ago this year, the first missionaries arrived in Hawaii, and that began a process of colonization that has impacted indigenous Hawaiian folks and folks who immigrated still even today in all sorts of ways. So I'm sure that as we continue to look forward, we'll do some more intentionality of doing research in that. And those of you who are watching, I'm totally going to call you for that too. So we will look into that particularly in going forward too. So I've said why this matters to me, and now that each of you have shared something, I'm going to reflect that question back to you. Why does this work matter to you? Why does it matter to you to go this deep? So I'll start with Caroline.
Well, I think as you've mentioned, Chris, I believe you can't really know where you're going until you know where you've been. And I agree with you about lifting up not just the inspirational parts that we might find inspirational, but also looking at the hard parts and looking for the hidden histories as well. I know for me, I'm always interested in women and the contributions of women in ministry and such. And we know those were not always lifted up because a lot of early history, especially, was written by men. So I think I've always found, I've taught a lot of adult ed in congregations, and even folks who are newer in the United Church of Christ, they are curious about the history, even if they come into the denomination for totally different reasons or don't have family heritage here. I've often found that they're very curious nonetheless about where we've come from. And I think that's why the work is important to me.
Okay. I have to agree with a lot of what Carolyn said. I also take a look at it from the fact that I'm more of a trained professional historian, and I really think that we often lose sense of our history. I do teach it, and I'm always struck by how little my students know of our nation's history. So certainly they're not going to know much about their church history. And there are some things here that are really important to remember and to build on.
Amen. Amen. We cannot know where we are going without knowing where we are from. So I'm going to take that and dive back into some of our evangelical side history with Caroline along the way. And let's go to the texts that have helped form us.
Thanks, Chris. So the second item that we have from ERHS today is the Mural Bible. And this is from the Evangelical or E side of the tradition. And we really want to thank our archivist, Scott Hall at Eden Seminary, for providing this. It's a very important holding in the Eden Seminary archives. It belonged to Ludwig Edward Mural, whose activities led to the founding of the German Evangelical Church Society of the West, which later became known as the Evangelical Synod of North America. And Mural brought this Bible with him from Germany. It's signed and dated October 18th, 1832, the year he began training as a missionary at the Rhenish Mission Society. And it has a lot of notes, as you can see in the margins. And the Bible was restored in 2009 by Richard C. Baker, a book and paper conservator in St. Louis, through a grant from the Deaconess Foundation. So a little bit about Nolau and how this relates to the UCC today. Nolau was born in 1810 in Reichenbach, Saxony. There you see the binding for the Bible. In 1826, he entered the Prussian army with the intention of becoming a civil servant, but he had a conversion experience and he became called into missionary work. And he was accepted by the Rhenish Mission Society in Barmen and then later ordained. And he ended up traveling to St. Louis to join other missionaries on a wagon train west, heading toward Oregon to work with Native Americans. But the mission was abandoned and Nolau remained in St. Louis, and instead he began ministering to many of the German immigrants arriving in the area, setting up preaching stations, and he founded what is now St. John's UCC in Melville, Missouri, where he served as pastor. And he also started to realize that the pastors needed some mutual support in the area. And he invited some other German Protestant clergymen in the area to meet at St. John's in October 1840.
One might call that one of the first communities of practice.
Yes, absolutely. I was thinking the same thing. Thank you, Chris. And anyway, they ended up forming the German Evangelical Church Society of the West, but it ended up becoming, growing into the denomination that we know as the Evangelical Synod of North America. And, but what I really want to emphasize about social justice and social ministry, Nolau began to recognize the needs that were present. And this concern led him to establish Good Samaritan Hospital and the Evangelical Children's Home in 1857 as charitable institutions. The Evangelical Children's Home continues on today as Every Child's Hope. The hospital changed its mission in the 19th century and became a retirement home, and it later closed. Nolau also, his first wife and son died, unfortunately, and he went on to have several children with his second wife, and they became pastors or had a daughter who married a pastor. And bringing this into contemporary time, you may know the name Nolau through the Council for Health and Human Services Ministries, Chisholm. They have the Nolau Institute. And I think we probably will have a resource for that. And also, again, with the UCC Historical Council, Nancy Nolau Mack is the current chair, and she is an ordained pastor and Louis Nolau's descendant.
There's so much to be said. You know, I am learning a lot in this conversation too. So I am very grateful to each of you for bringing things in. For those of us that are with us live, do know that you can ask questions by using the Q&A beneath the screen, or if you're watching alongside the YouTube, the resources that we've been mentioned will be beneath the video in the description box. So do know that that is part of where you can access that which we are saying along the way. And I am amazed by how much of this is all tied together. You know, the Nolau Institute and the work that Chisholm does is still helping with health and human service agencies. And, you know, even as we as a denomination continue to learn and lean into our values, we still have all of these ways where we are doing what we can for people who are in need. And we've got a whole bunch of different ways to do that. Some of that is direct service, and some of that is system change and justice work and advocacy work. And all of this is in partnership with each other and informed by where we have been and how we can learn better. So thank you. Oh, I want to move to our next piece to share, which I think is coming from you as well, Caroline. Yes, because we are going in a timeline. Now, I want to be attentive. The things that we've looked at so far are both in the early 1800s. And we're going to kind of shift ahead a little bit, about 80 years, and look into 1915, where some of our the theological masterminds that many of us have learned about in seminary enter the conversation. So with that having been said, we're going to let them enter the chat. Back to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Chris. This is another item from the East Side or Evangelical tradition. Again, thank you to Eden Seminary Archives and Scott Hall for providing this. But this is, I really love this item. I love all our items, but I love old photos. And this is the graduation photo from 1915 of H. Richard Niebuhr, his graduation photo from Eden Seminary. And some of you may have photos like this in your family, right? I mean, we have those things. That's why I just love it so much. If you are wondering who he was, and you may recognize the name Niebuhr, he was a product of the German Evangelical Synod, and he had broad influence as a public theologian in America. And he also had a profound influence on the direction of the Evangelical Synod as it moved toward union with the Reformed Church. And that's why it's very interesting for us at ERHS. So H. Richard was born on September 3rd, 1894 in Wright City, Missouri. His father, Gustav, was a German immigrant and a pastor in the Evangelical Synod. And his mother, Lydia, was herself was a daughter of an Evangelical Synod pastor. Now, I know some folks watching may wonder or know this, so I will say it out. This is the younger brother of Reinhold Niebuhr, who was also a prominent public theologian and professor of theology at Union Theological Seminary, in case you were wondering about that. But back to H. Richard, he graduated from Elmhurst College in 1912, which was established as a pro-seminary or a preparatory institution by the Evangelical Synod. And then he graduated from Eden, of course. He went on to earn a master's from Washington University and a PhD from Yale. He taught at Eden. He served as president of Elmhurst. Returned to Eden again, and then he was on the faculty at Yale from 1931 to 1962. Now, where this comes into looking toward a union with the Reformed Church, in March 1919, the magazine of the Evangelical Synod published one of his articles called "Where Shall We Go?" And the reason this article was important is it came on the heels of some other developments in American Protestantism. One of them was the 1918 merger creating the United Lutheran Church in America. And then there was also a conference that was organized by the Presbyterian Church to start thinking about union among all the Calvinistic Reformed churches in the US. So H. Richard's article was highlighting where would this denomination fit the Evangelical Synod. They were historically a mix of Lutheranism and Calvinism, as you may know, coming from the Prussian history and German history, so bringing that here to the US. And because of that, it wasn't easy for them to think about where they would fit or union, even if they desired that. So his article put forward that it might be a good idea to look for merging with the Reformed denominations. He didn't think they would fit very well with the Lutherans. And also, he also was emphasizing God's reign in the world along the lines of what we've been talking about, our heritage, where there was this heritage in on the Reform side of being in the public sphere, a little more than on the Lutheran side. So moving toward union in 1927, the Evangelical Synod president, John Balzer, appointed H. Richard as chair of the denomination's commission of closer relations with other church bodies. And this commission's work led to negotiations with the Reformed Church and a merger to form the E&R Church in 1934. So now we've moved all the way up to the merger in 1934.
I'm joking. The ecumenists in the crowd start to go wild. We came in. We're going to let Ed speak to this momentarily, but I do want to say that those of us who have gone through the polity and the history courses in order to continue this work of the United Church of Christ as to who we are and where we want to be. There's the story that we tell that in 1957 there was the E&R Church, and then there was the Congregationalists, and then there was the Christians, and they came together at an historic event. And I've recently heard it said that we could even think about a fifth strand, and this is Dr. Audrey Price referenced this, a fifth strand of those who have come to join the United Church of Christ thereafter that 1957 merger, thinking about groups like those who are congregations of immigrants, those who are much like our early history, those who have joined as a result of the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries, those who have joined because they want to do something new and see that our theological commitments are closest aligned. So we're still figuring that piece out. But before we go into that more, let's go all the way back to that day in 1957 to you, my friend Ed.
Okay. Well, I'm waiting for the piece to show up. I think we may be a little out of order, but that's okay. I have presented a pair of photos from the Uniting Synod of 1957. And here's the first one, showing the procession down Superior Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio, as they are going to the Cleveland Music Hall. And in the front are the respective leaders of the E&R Church and the Congregational Christian churches. On the far left is Reverend James Wagner, and next to him is Reverend Fred Hoskins. Now, these may not be particularly unique, except in one regard. They're in color. Most of the photos of General Synods through at least the mid-1980s are always in black and white. And in fact, this set of transparencies that was intermingled with the 1985 General Synod. It somehow got misplaced. But this is the first one, and if we can go to the next one, maybe, there we are. This is Hoskins and Wagner, either shortly before or shortly after their handshake that symbolized the completion of the Union. These are really beautiful transparencies, actually, because you really cannot get a sense of the pageantry and the color that was the Uniting Synod until you see these. It's a really just beautiful pieces.
They absolutely are. I'm cognizant that even when we look towards our history, what we lift up are moments. We lift up these pieces that are representative of so much more, or these moments. And that Uniting Synod, and took so much more than what we reflect on it. The ways in which, as my colleague Elizabeth Dilly would say, people were being people-y, how folks were with each other, all the background work to get everything attentive, all the conversations over all the years, over all the negotiations, over all the lawsuits, over all the, all of these various pieces of our history that show not only those moments of celebration that we now remember as a moment, but also the work that went into them. I know for me, that gives me incredible hope, because I see us in a moment of preparation and in a moment of gathering, in a moment of reckoning of how do we do this, and we continue to look forward to the places where we will have those moments in our history, in the history of 2020, however this year will close and move to the next. And having said that, let's see. I want to ask Ed a question about before that uniting synod. What were some of those moments of how those churches practiced working together, or how they got to there?
It's really interesting that if we go back to my piece on the safe passage, well, 1826 is also the year that the German Reformed Church formed its own missionary society. And in the 1830, if I recall this correctly, they actually began working directly with ABC-FM and continued to do so until 1866. Thereafter, there would be sporadic work together, but ultimately that's what drew them both together, is that they were engaged in so much of the same type of work towards justice that despite the differences in polity, they felt that they could come together and work together.
Feels like a moment to bring in the Mercersburg Creed. Do you know that one offhand, Caroline?
No, but I hope I can talk a little bit about that. I mean, and that's a shout out to our lovely friends at the Mercersburg Society.
Let me see if I have it. And you all can help too. What is it in all things important in the charity? Oh, it'll come. Go ahead. You speak to that while I figure it out.
Yes, but that is definitely the ecumenical impulse. Thank you for bringing that up, Chris. Yes, as well.
All right, I was phoning a friend in the, and there it is. Aaron Lauer bringing it in essentials unity, in non-essentials diversity, in all things charity. And that absolutely speaks to those early days, even as much as where that came from. And in some ways, it speaks to the work that we collectively do as church now. In essentials unity, in non-essentials diversity. There's so much difference of opinion and a difference of practice and difference of ritual and difference of church all among us. And in all things charity. So, I mean, I love how our history continues with these threads of how are we in covenant together? How are we intentionally in relationship with each other? And how do we look towards our future with that difference as one of our strengths? There it is. From there, where are we going? I got lost in the midst of getting excited about some of these stories. All right, so we're going to move from there to Ed. You were bringing in something of art. Augustine does get their credit. Thank you, Rock, for that one. Some of the art that came in. Now, so those of you who were watching alongside our last General Synod noticed that one of our theological reflectors was an artist, and she painted alongside that which was happening throughout the course of the General Synod. So this piece really reflected some of that to me in terms of how does art reflect our theology as well. So I'm passing it back to you, Ed, to bring that into the conversation.
Okay. This is very small photo of a very large piece of art that is in the archives. This is Sister Karita Kent's Beatitudes mural. She created this piece for the 1964 World's Fair, where it was exhibited at the Vatican Pavilion. As I understand it, it was actually the first thing that you would have seen when you went into that pavilion. It was purchased by the United Church of Christ after the World's Fair closed. Now, there's actually no documentation. I believe this was actually purchased by the United Church Board for Homeland Ministries We don't have their records in Cleveland, so I suspect that's why I can't find it. But it's 40 feet long by 4 feet wide, as you could see from that one image where they are actually working on cleaning it at the Cleveland Museum of Contemporary Art, where it was placed on exhibit in 2014. That exhibit happened in part because I received notification from the Sister Karita Kent Society in California that there was a special exhibit of her work going on. So I contacted MoCA to see if they were interested in exhibiting it, and they very much were. As you can see, there's a couple of close-ups of two sections of it. Sister Karita interspersed sections from the Sermon on the Mount with quotations from leaders of the 1960s. It's a really beautiful piece, but it's really not an easy one to work with. It actually does need some more cleaning and preservation work.
So what are the future hopes of displaying that?
I would really love to have this exhibited somewhere. The biggest problem is it's 40 feet long. It has to have its own wall. And most institutions would probably be daunted by that. My wife works at the Cleveland Museum of Art. I really would love to have them put it on exhibit there. I don't know that that's ever going to happen, though.
Sometimes we speak the hopes that we have. You know, we cannot create that which we cannot imagine. So if we're manifesting a hope for displaying something like that, then, you know, we'll name that.
Yeah.
Ooh, do you have the any of those quotes in a way that you could read them out? I know our images can't read them out. Do you have that accessible? While he's thinking about that, we're going to pull this up on the screen.
I know there are quotes from individuals, Kennedy, Gandhi. I'd be hard-pressed to remember all of them because, again, it's such a big piece that you just kind of get overwhelmed by it.
Thank you. I think that's a great leap off into the last specific moment in these histories that we want to show you. But before we go there, I do want to say that even as we've done this, it's become really clear to me that this is the first of what is likely a series lifting up moments of UCC history. Let's talk some about, you know, these pieces that we are aware of, but also there's so much more that we are not aware of, the hidden histories of our people and the impacts of how we have been or have not been, and the wonderment of those who have stayed in covenant with us all along the way, even still. So I want to name that as intention for 2021 is to do some more intentional hidden histories conversations throughout what we are doing here together. And it may include guests like Ed and Caroline again, or we may, and hopefully reach out and invite. So in the midst of that, I also want to name that there has been a couple of questions that have come through. So before we go to our last piece, I'm going to bring this into the conversation. For each of you, there are a couple of people that have their own connections to these events and are offering up copies of letters or photos associated with them. So what are the kind of things that you are studying and or would like to receive from people, and how? Let's start there for each of you. And if you're ready to go, just go for it.
Sure. On our side, primarily, if you have anything from the German Reformed or our side or the E side, you personally, perhaps you had a pastor in your family, a deaconess in your family, we would be interested in that, or also congregations, of course, if there are pastors here that have heritage church with ties to us, we'd be interested in hearing from you and working with you, any of that. We do take some other things as well, but primarily we're interested in things with an E or an R tie.
Okay. I'm a little bit more selective out of necessity because I really don't have much space and there's no staff except for me part-time. Since my focal point is on collecting records pertaining to the national offices, anyone who has records that are pertinent to that, certainly I would be interested in. I'm also very, very happy to get published histories of the local churches. I really think those are important pieces that need to be preserved. Even if they're a little anniversary thing that's 10 pages in length, I'd love to have that.
That's incredible. And these images, we've referenced these images, and some of you have also asked if you could use them or get them. And we will put the images, particularly those photos, in the follow-up email as well, so that you can see them or use them as you are teaching in local settings. In the midst of that, we're going to move to our last set of pictures where Ed is presenting a historical moment that any of you who are using that, do you remember that video we did, we the United Church of Christ, the video that we did at the 50th anniversary of the United Church of Christ, where Hans did a flyback of like, and let's remember these moments. This is one of those moments. So this is one of those moments where all I knew of it was Hans' memory of it and occasionally folks talking about it. And now we're going to go a little bit deeper and hear some from Ed about that moment when
The Coachella event. This is a set of images. Again, this comes from a participant in the Coachella Valley demonstration of 1973. What had happened is at the Ninth General Synod, there was a call for volunteers to go to the Coachella Valley as witnesses to the plight of the farmers there. 95 delegates and visitors went. They responded, flew from St. Louis to California, and then subsequently back in the space of about a day and a half. There they supported the striking workers of the United Farm Workers. They manned a picket line, and they otherwise learned more about what the UFW was doing in its protest against non-union grapes and lettuces. So this is actually a set of 95 images that came from a participant who sent her negatives. And the first two images, of course, you see the flag of the United Church of Christ, which they took from the General Synod. And here are some very tired UCC participants. And then there's a last image of the leader of the UFW, Cesar Chavez. So this is really a nice piece that clearly shows the activity of the church in its pursuit of social justice. So.
That's amazing to me. You know, when I saw those first, I was thinking about how 2 years ago in 2019, much of the conference staff and the national staff were attending an event called Authorizing Ministry for the 21st Century, where, you know, it's an event where those folks who are trying to think through our polity with intention at that level are doing so. And much of the crowd went to Tijuana and stood on the border and marched with clergy for immigration justice. And I'm thinking how those threads continue to move through our history and into our future with a clarity of you know, who have we been and who do we want to be. And I wanna also name in that photo, going back to some of that photo, Davida Crabtree is lifting up that Lynn Simcox is there next to Caesar as well. So want to name that too. Go ahead.
Hey, she's the one who sent the photos.
There we go. So these moments, you know, and I'm thinking like, what are even the things that we are doing now? How do we lift up this hope? You know, this is an event that helped me understand who the United Church of Christ is and why I wanted to be involved. So many of these things carry that, who we are as the United Church of Christ, and what are the significant roots that bring us back to the threads of church that have formed all of whom we are. So I want to pause for a minute and lift up our final thing, which is out of order chronologically, because in the midst of everything else, I want to lift up this posture of prayer and invite Caroline to speak towards that.
I think it's a good segue, even though it's a little bit out of the chronological order. Maybe we have to be open to the Spirit moving, but it is another wonderful piece of art, and it does speak again to the importance of doing social justice work and mission work and helping those in need. So this is actually an item from the E&R Church. So post-merger, post-1934, and that's why I really wanted to show it, to show you that we do have items from the combined church and not just from the predecessor bodies. It's a wonderful sculpture that was presented Evangelical and Reformed Church by the West German government following World War II. So, of course, both traditions had a history of following Christ's commands to love and serve others. And they took that into the merger, and the merged church was involved in issues of poverty, labor, peace, and justice. And this statue speaks to the fact that the church established several there was a war emergency relief commission established by the General Synod of 1940 of the E&R Church, and to start assisting with the massive need and destruction caused by World War II. And then this work was carried on in 1953 by the Commission on World Service. And I think it's important to note that President Goebbels had issued a challenge of raising $100,000 toward relief efforts. In the end, the E&R Church raised $48 million for regular missions and $12 million more for world services. So, I mean, this is just a testament to the relief work that was done by the E&R Church post World War II. And in gratitude for that, the West German government presented to statue the hand sculpture by the renowned artist Cade. And it's called Lamentation in memory of Ernst Barlach, who died in 1938. It's a bronze and was presented to the church in 1951 by the German people in gratitude for the relief work done after World War II. And I just think that's maybe a really good way to wrap this up. Another point to the history and heritage we have of doing this kind of work.
You know, I see that as not only a way to bring us there, but a model of what our work is now. You know, that the impacts of the world wars on our collective society are, we're already at a point where the impact of this pandemic on our society is calling for that kind of response. And the United Church of Christ is stepping up with various ways, like our medical debt relief campaigns, like all of the things that we are intentionally doing in covenant with one another and leaning towards the world and the church that we want to be, united in Christ's love, a just world for all. So I will leave you with that question, which is what is it that the church and our God, our gospel, is calling us towards in our future, with awareness that this was just a flyby of some of the moments we thought interesting to highlight, intention to do this more with histories and hidden histories, an invitation for you to wonder into what is God calling for us as church right now, given all of this. So if this has moved you, if this has inspired you or given you a resource that you can work with within your local congregation, when you say, who are we? then I hope that you will consider donating into the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. And I also want to let you know that this is part of an ongoing series and that there are incredible things coming up your way. Specifically, on Thursday, we're going to be in grief together in a Blue Christmas service. During the course of this service, we will be lifting up that grief, and we will be lifting up the isolation and loneliness that is rampant right now because of all of the things we need to do to keep each other safe, as well as lifting up and mourning those who have died by overdose. So just note that those will be themes that come throughout the service. And then on next Tuesday, together we will be doing something great that is taking a while to load. Next Tuesday, oh my goodness, we're gonna have a hymn sing. So if you want to come and see some of these hymn videos that are available to use in local congregations, or just join alongside, I don't know about you, but I don't get enough of these hymns throughout the season, and this is a season where I want all of them, like, every day. So come and join alongside us. You can wear your favorite Christmas outfits, and if you want to wear those outfits and let me know that you want to show the outfit to the world, we might even promote you to a panelist and you can show everybody. So that will be a lot of fun, and that's what we'll be doing. That's what we'll be doing collectively a week from today. So having said all that, Caroline, would you like to close us in prayer, or would you like me to?
No, you can do that, Chris. I would appreciate it. I think you would
Absolutely.
probably pull us all together and pull us all together as one in the UCC.
Yeah, we started with that they may be one, and that is an ongoing theme throughout everything that we do, is that, even and especially the places where we have difference are the places where we are made strong because of the wisdom of all. So let us pray. Holy One, we thank you for your grace with us. We thank you for the opportunity to look carefully at some of the pieces that have brought us into who we are today. We thank you for the opportunity to acknowledge the places where we have failed and imagine the places and work towards those places where we can collectively be the church that you imagine us to be together. We ask for grace in the midst of all things, especially as we hold on to our traditions, our histories, our hopes, and our imaginations. And we ask that your gospel may be present in the world in all of the wild ways you can imagine it for our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren. Even as we move into the future you would have for us, I always ask your blessing upon us. It is in the name of Jesus Christ that I pray. Amen. Blessings to all, and may the rest of your day include rest and joy.